Hello, and welcome to another episode of this podcast titled In the Name of Jesus. This is the third episode, and today we're going to speak about another subject that I feel might be a little controversial among those audiences that are going through a consciousness awakening of some sort, and that's the topic of sin. And the reason why I think it's controversial, it might be because of some rejection towards the religious message that condemns the entire human race because it's sinful, because it's dirty, or because we're all sinners. And I understand it completely because I also share that kind of rejection to the religious message that is condemning. However, today we're going to explore deeper into this subject and what it really means to sin, or what it really means to have fallen into sin as humanity. Because even though in all kinds of consciousness awakening circles and all kinds of groups that follow different philosophical doctrines or spiritual alternatives of all kinds, even though we talk about how our essence is love and how the divine origin of mankind is love, which I feel these are topics that are very spoken of in these alternative spirituality or alternative philosophical circles. And maybe that's also the reason why the topic of sin is one that is very rejected. However, we cannot deny that there has been a lack of congruence with this loving essence that we are, and the state of the world is enough evidence to acknowledge this incoherence. I also think this might be something that we're all in agreement in all the different circles that explore consciousness awakening. This is something that is spoken of a lot, and it's about restoring coherence with our loving essence, which is what many people call killing the ego or the death of the ego. So there is a recognition that there has been a lack of coherence, lack of congruence with that love that we are. And in the end, that's what sin is. That's what sin is about, although in religious wording. So, in this episode, we're going to explore a bit more into this topic, seeking to remove the religious dogma that the word sin has carried with it, and that I think has brought a lot of pain to humanity, which unfortunately has also come in the way between us and the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Because the religious institutions have used this word so much to condemn people that it has brought a rejection to the true gospel, to the true good news of Jesus Christ, which are actually the sustainable solution that we have all been looking for, specifically in these audiences that have gone through a consciousness awakening of some sort. So I feel this is where we find common grounds in acknowledging that there is an incoherence that needs to be solved, that there has been a lack of congruence with how we were created in the image and likeness of God, or in other words, with that loving essence that we know we are. So let's start to look deeper into this topic of sin. When my encounter with Christ recently started, and when I was starting to see new definitions to words that come up in the Bible without that religious lens that caused this religious trauma in my childhood, one of the first words that I researched was the word sin, the etymology of the word sin. And I found that this word in Spanish, pecado, comes from the Latin peccatum. That means crime, fault, or a guilty action. And when I saw this meaning, the word that most caught my attention was the word fault, which in Spanish would be falta. And the reason for this was because in my consciousness awakening journey, it had become really evident to me how collectively we have been living outside of the present moment, how the human mind has this tendency to get out of the present moment and has become either so obsessed with the past in depression or so obsessed with the future, trying to have it all under control, and that would be anxiety. So I already had this knowledge of how coming back to the present moment had a direct correlation with letting go of these anxieties and depressions and attachments of the mind. So when I saw this word fault or falta in Spanish, the first thing that caught my attention was how a fault or falta is a kind of absence. In Spanish, the word for fault can be used as a synonym for when something is lacking, for when there is an absence of something. For example, when you say falta esta persona, fault in Spanish, what I'm saying there is that the person was absent. There was a lack of that person. There was an absence. Or, for example, closer to the English use of the word fault, when you say that a sports team has committed a fault, what is lacking there? What kind of absence is there in that example? Well, what you notice that is lacking in this example would be integrity, right? There was a lack of integrity. There was a fault to integrity, an absence of it. So, having this connection between the word fault and the concept of absence, of lack, it becomes so revealing to realize that the opposite of absence is presence, right? So, when I saw this etymology of the Spanish word for sin, pecado, I immediately felt this revelation of how it is true that whenever we're being incoherent with our loving essence, it is because we are not truly present right here, right now. Therefore, we are absent. There is an absence of us in the now, in the eternal present moment. So, right now, we're already starting to see the characteristics of the topic of sin and the incoherence that there has been in humanity with our essence and with love. I think it is quite accurate to observe that whenever we're having self destructive behavior or behavior that is harmful towards others, there is a sense of absence in us. And if we really think about it, this is what the seven deadly sins are. To me, these are different forms in which we get out of the present moment. For example, gluttony. We know that simply eating food is not a sin, right? But when we have an addictive relationship to food, when we want more and more and more, there it becomes gluttony and it becomes one of the seven deadly sins. And what happens when we have this kind of addictive relationship to food? Well, we know that we're not truly present with the food that we are tasting in this very moment. It's this kind of behavior in which we haven't even finished the cake that we have in front of us. We haven't even allowed ourselves to enjoy this cake that we have right now in front of us. We're not giving it our full presence to truly taste it. And we are already thinking about the next piece of cake that we want to have. That's gluttony. It's an absence to the present moment, it's addiction. And there's plenty of evidence to this. There are many people that speak into how mindfulness, which is the active and intentional awareness of the present moment, actually helps people eat slower and eat less. Because when you're truly present with your food, you enjoy it more and you realize that you don't really want more than that because you've truly enjoyed your meal right here, right now. You're not thinking about the next one you want to have. With this same example of gluttony and the absence that we are living in when we are being gluttonous, we can also realize that when we are absent from the present moment, we're not really being sensible enough or sensitive enough to how we feel right here, right now, with this piece of cake that we just ate or that we are eating in the present. Therefore, we don't really realize how maybe we are already satisfied with this piece of cake and that we really don't want another one. And since we're not really present with our stomach that might be telling us, don't give me any more because I'm already full. I already feel good with this food. This is enough. I'm satisfied. Then we don't pay attention to how our body feels. We fall into this addictive behavior. We are being gluttonous. We eat more and then we feel ill in the end. We feel too full. We feel bad with ourselves. We can even feel sick, right? This is a kind of self destructive behavior. This is an example of how sin harms us. So I feel we're starting to identify the components of sin or this tendency to be incoherent with the love that we all come from. And this is the absence of the present moment. And another one can also be the addiction that comes from being absent to our lives right here, right now. The kind of addiction that gets us out of the present moment. Again, the seven deadly sins are simply examples of an addictive relationship with things that we want to do, but that we abuse of that. Why? Because we're out of the present moment. Therefore, we're always seeking for more and more and more. It's never enough. And here is where we touch a very interesting topic, something that relates to this addictive component of sin is the topic of pleasure. And unfortunately, we know that religion has demonized pleasure because it has taught us that pleasure is bad, pleasure is evil, that pleasure only comes from sin, right? That the flesh wants to fall into the temptations of pleasure. So there has been this kind of religious distortion in the perception of pleasure itself. Because God created us, and God makes no mistakes, God created us in this physical body with the ability to feel pleasure, with nerve endings that allow us to feel pleasure. And that's not a mistake from God. Again, we were created in His image and likeness. So, where does this distortion in pleasure come from? This is where it is useful to look at the difference between the pleasure of addiction, where pleasure causes an addictive behavior or an addictive response in us, and the pleasure of connection. To me, these two words reveal so much to us because truth is that every human being is in the search of connection. We were created for connection. Therefore, when we don't feel this connection, when we don't feel this love, the result will be to unconsciously look for that connection in other places. This is where we fall into the pleasure of addiction. So let's analyze this into detail. We know that connection produces pleasure. Of course, because we all like to feel connected. We all like to feel that true connection with someone else, or how we feel with a true connection with life itself, or even a true connection with ourselves. When we are so present with life that we are enjoying a beautiful sunset, that we feel so touched by that moment, that speaks to us about the pleasure of connection. So when we lack this kind of pleasure, this kind of delight in life and in the connection of living, we look for this pleasure in other things and we fall into the pleasure of addiction, which would be sin. And one of the main differences between pleasure of addiction and pleasure of connection is how the pleasure of addiction looks outside for what it is lacking on the inside, or what someone perceives that he or she is lacking on the inside. So it comes from a place of lack. It comes from a place of feeling I'm incomplete. So therefore, I have to start looking elsewhere so that something outside of me completes me. This is different to the pleasure of connection that comes from a place of recognizing your own fulfillment right here, right now. And a huge example of this is recognizing how even when I can connect to another human being, I would never be able to connect with that person if before that I didn't connect to myself in some way. And that is what allows connection with that person in the specific aspect where we are resonating with them. Where there is resonance or connection or harmony with another person, it is because before that, prior to that, I had already connected to myself inside of me in relation to that topic, in relation to that same aspect where they are finding resonance with me, and vice versa. If this hadn't happened before, there is no authentic connection. Why? Because it would simply be the false identities, the egoic masks interacting with each other that are quote unquote connecting, but in reality, they're not connecting. They're just looking for that pleasure of addiction, that same addictive behavior, which results in codependency, in forcing ourselves to fit in with a specific group, etc. So, the first difference between the pleasure of addiction and the pleasure of connection would be that addiction is constantly seeking outside what it can only find on the inside. Connection knows that this authentic pleasure can only start from within. Another difference that goes hand in hand with this is that the pleasure of addiction makes us dependent on an external thing. Therefore, it makes us slaves because we are depending on having more food, more food, more food in the example that we said previously, or more success, more sex, more money, more substances, more of whatever that fake identity found either comfort in or a sense of identity that the egoic mask has created. This is different to the pleasure of connection, which happens when you find that connection within with your own essence, which is God, because we know that God is the essence of everything, the origin of everything, the original one. So when I find this connection to God, to essence with a capital E, the opposite happens. It liberates me from being dependent and addicted to those external things. Why? Because now I've gone from being dependent on outside things to being dependent on the only one who can truly liberate me, which is God, which is truth. And this is alignment to truth. The only true freedom is freedom that is aligned to truth. Anything else will be a form of slavery, even if our ego calls it freedom. So again, God is truth, God is love. So when I place my dependence on God, the result is freedom. It is a paradox, but it is only a paradox to the egoic identity that has been identifying itself so much with its own will and doing whatever it wants to do. But it is not a paradox to our true essence. It's the only way it truly knows. It's the freedom that it's been thirsting for all our lives. So, pleasure of connection actually liberates us. Another main difference is that the pleasure of addiction lasts very little, and the suffering that surfaces afterwards lasts longer than the actual pleasure that only happens real quick for that moment. That's why you always keep coming back for more and more and more, because the pleasure that it produces is not long lasting. Why? Because it is an artificial pleasure. It was only momentary. Whereas pleasure of connection is long lasting because it is actually real. It does hold substance because it comes from the depths of our own being and it comes directly from God, which is the substance of life. The only one that is eternal, the only one that is not gonna fade away with time, which is God. And here is when we start looking at the contrast between pleasure of addiction or sin, which results in the incoherence of mankind, and true pleasure, for which we were actually created, because we were created for that. And evidence of this is the word Eden from the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve were before taking from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, this word Eden means delight. We were created for the delight, for the pleasure, for the beauty of truth. So pleasure isn't bad. And I hope this episode releases that perception that condemns pleasure for those who have had a religious lens all their lives. And at the same time, I hope that this episode invites other people that have felt rejection towards the gospel or the good news of Jesus Christ because of how harmful the perception of sin has been collectively through the religious institution. I hope these people can open themselves up to the most beautiful pleasure, which is that of connection. The kind of connection that we can only find in the present moment, because here and now is where we find communion with the great I am. The great I am right here, right now. It's not the great I was, it's not the great I will be, it's the great I am in the eternity of the present moment. So, in other words, to me, the great I am is actually the great present moment. Jesus is the great I am. And now I want to share an anecdote with you guys, because maybe to my Christian friends, these are words that can even be redundant because they listen to it all the time. But for those of us that come from a context of alternative spirituality, where the presence I am is so spoken of, but not so much about Jesus in the sense of being the Savior and being the great I am, it was a very beautiful moment for me when I realized, when I opened my eyes to how Jesus is the great I am. And it was through the French language that in French you would say je suis to say I am. So you translate I am as je suis in French. And it is actually spelled Jesuis. So when I read this phrase in French that says je suis, I am, I also read Jesus at the same time because it is spelled almost the same, just removing the I. So it came through a moment of revelation of reading in the words je suis, I read I am Jesus. Je suis Jesus. And it was a very profound moment for me. You know how God moves through synchronicity? And right after that very moment, my mom had already been playing Christian music in the background. But right after that moment, I listened to a Christian song that starts singing, Jesus is the great I am. And I was like, what's going on? What's this? And I just felt what I know now is the presence of the Holy Spirit. And it was a really huge revelation for me because I had never actually sat down to process this affirmation that Jesus is the great I am. I could even tell you that maybe I had never heard of that because I wasn't really involved in Christian content before, maybe in my childhood or somewhere really quick, but that was the first time that I actually slowed down to process it. And this, of course, happened hand in hand with the whole encounter I was having with Christ at the beginning of my journey with Him. All of this put together with different Bible verses and different teachings can start to reveal us more. I think we can start to place different puzzle pieces together and look at the big picture, which I feel reveals to us how important it is to be in the present moment and how that's actually something that God wants to communicate to us. And we can share a few examples of this. One of them is the piece in the Old Testament where the Israelites, God's people, had to be in the desert for a very long time, and God gave them manna, which is bread from heaven, so that they could survive. At this time, they didn't know how they would survive, where they would be able to get their food from, but God gave them manna, this bread from heaven. And one of the instructions that God gave them was to not put together manna for the next day, not accumulate more than you need for this day, for today. So he basically told them, yes, I'm going to make sure you can survive. I'll give you bread from heaven, but all you need to do is eat enough for today. Don't save for tomorrow. Because if they did, which is an example of the mind seeking control over the future, if they did, the manna, the bread from heaven, would rot. It would go bad in the very next day. It would only be good for that same day in which God gave them the meal. Another example can be found in Matthew 6:34 that tells us to not worry about tomorrow because tomorrow will have its own worries. It is enough with today's challenges, today's problems or situations that help our growth, if we want to look at them in this way. So don't look forward to tomorrow's worries. It is enough with the ones you have today. This is another very clear message to not get ahead of ourselves and not get into our heads trying to control the future, but to live fully for today, for the now, for the present moment. Another example is when Jesus talks about how the birds don't worry about what they're going to eat tomorrow and how God knows, he's very conscious of how the birds need to eat. So God feeds the birds. And he says, now imagine you, human being, you that were created in his image and likeness, that you're so important to God. How can we even entertain this mindset that thinks that God is not going to give us what we need, just as he does with the birds? So Jesus tells us in these verses, don't worry for tomorrow, live for today. So we start to look at a pattern in these teachings in the Bible about living in the present moment, living right here, right now. And of course, this requires a lot of trust, right? Enough trust to be able to live solely for today and not try to control out of mistrust in life, not control for tomorrow. Trust that tomorrow will take care of itself, that God will give us what we need. Just like the Israelites had to learn that manna would come down from heaven tomorrow, that God would take care of them, just like the birds are not worrying for tomorrow. Of course, they have an advantage over us. They don't have a mind that can actually worry about the future. But my point here is that it requires trust. And this brings us back to episode number 1 that spoke about this, about how trusting life is trusting God. So, actually, coming back to the present moment and taking it very seriously to start living in this space of presence will show us the areas where we don't trust God yet. And the areas where we don't trust God yet also tend to be those areas where we fall into sin. Again, focusing on this characteristic of sin that involves absence, being absent from the present moment, this tendency to go out of the present moment, to be lost in that fake identity of the ego that wants to keep accumulating more and more and more things in the pleasure of addiction to feel all right. These are the areas where we don't trust God. At the same time, they're the areas where we want to gain control so desperately. So that's why we tend to get ahead of ourselves with mental strategies to control the future perfectly. And then we are excessively thinking how to keep that control. So we are desperately making an effort to control our reality. When the truth is that the only one that truly knows the plans of the future for you, because he's the omnipresent one, the omniscient one, the all knowing one, and the all powerful one, is God. And this to me could be the main reason why God hates sin so much. And I know this affirmation that God hates can be something that the groups of alternative spirituality don't quite agree with. And I understand because sadly, I feel like religion has made this word mean that the wrath of God, which is mentioned in the Bible, has made this word to mean that the wrath of God is against us because we are sinners and because we are dirty and because we are evil. But all of that is actually a misinterpretation because the wrath of God is against sin itself. It is against our tendency to be absent. It is against that confusion in our identity that keeps us outside of the present moment, trying and trying and trying to deserve love, which in next episodes we will speak about this subject, about how ridiculous it is to try to deserve love. But that's why the wrath of God is geared towards that harms us. Why? Because he loves us. He loves us unconditionally. So of course he's going to hate that which harms us, that which hurts his children. Because the opposite to love is not hate. The opposite to love is fear. Of course, God is not fearful of anything because God is love and perfect love casts out fear. But the hatred of God or the wrath of God is more like an extension of his love towards us. And there are several theologians that speak about this topic, about how God's wrath is a passionate extension of his love that seeks to protect us at all costs, that seeks to bring us back to intimacy with him at all costs, back to the trust in love, because God is love. So again, the wrath of God is not towards us, it is against sin itself, because it separates us from him, because it makes us absent from the present moment, the only moment, the eternity of the now, where we can actually have communion with him right here, right now. However, we have to be aware that it doesn't separate him from us. It separates us from him in the sense that it is only a separation that's happening in our perception. And this is also something very spoken about through different theologians that explain that it is our mental perception that perceives ourselves as separate from him. We fall into that illusion of separation and we believe it as if it were true, but it is a lie from the mind. And again, the word lie and mind in Spanish, mentira, mente, share etymology because that's where the lie has an impact in our minds. So when we start connecting the dots, we can see how all of that phenomenon is what happens when we come out of the present moment, when we are in absence from right here, right now. We fail to perceive ourselves in communion with God because, again, that communion is only lived right here, right now, in the present moment, in the great I am. And to wrap up this episode, I want to bring our attention to a parable that appears in the Bible that speaks about how a woman that has 10 coins of silver loses one. And she looks for that coin everywhere until she finds it. And when she finally finds that coin that was missing, she rejoices and she gets all happy and she tells everyone. And she's joyful about this lost coin that now she has back with her. In this parable, we are the coin that had been lost. And God is that woman that is looking everywhere for that coin until she finds it. And a very powerful revelation that comes from this parable that I really like how Francois Dutoit explains it in the Mirror translation of the Bible. He explains how the lost coin never really lost its value. It always continued being that silver coin that had the same value for the woman. And that's why she made such an effort to find it. Why? Because again, the lost coin never lost its value. It was still valuable, it was only lost. And another revelation from this parable would be to look at how this coin that was simply lost was also simply absent. Again, absence. The absence that has resulted from sin in us, an absence from the present moment. And another final thought before we wrap up, which I feel could be more for my Christian friends that are in a process of discernment between that which is simply men's tradition in religion, those religious ideas, and what is actually truth with a capital T from God, directly from God. Think about this, how in different religious circles, the phrase to purify humanity or to cleanse us from sin is used a lot. Well, even in this affirmation, we can see how sin is not an inherent part of us. It is not a part of our essence. It is not a part of who we truly are. Why? Because when you clean something, you remove everything that is not from it. You remove the stain, and the stain is not that thing that you are cleaning. In Spanish, it is very clear through the word purify, to make pure. Why? Because the word pure, that in English is used and also in Spanish as clean, is a synonym for the word only. So when you want to purify something, you want only the essence of that which you are cleaning. For example, when you want pure water, right? You want only water inside your water and nothing else. You want to remove everything that is not a part of the water. You want to remove the contaminants. And you want only water to remain. In the same way, when we say that we have to purify humanity, we are saying that I want only humanity. I want to remove from humans that which is not human, that which was never human in the first place, that which was never a part of our original design. That is sin. That has been our false identity, that we have believed as our true identity when it is not. Unfortunately, in religion, there is so much emphasis in sin that there has even been this belief that sin is an inherent part of humans. And what happens from this is that humans start to identify with sin itself. We start creating a whole identity from sin. We start believing, oh, that's just who I am. That's just the way I am. I'm just a simple sinner, right? I'm just a sinner. That's the way I am. It's as if that thing that we're trying to clean identifies itself with the stain. It's as if the water identifies itself with the contaminants. And it thinks that it is impossible to remove that stain because that stain is an inherent part of what it is, but it isn't. Again, the simple affirmation that we are seeking to clean humanity or purify humanity speaks about how sin is not an inherent part of humanity. And not only that, but also that the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ tell us that sin has already been eradicated. It has already been removed from us in the cross. So Jesus already did it. Jesus already ended that tendency to be absent, that tendency to come out of the present moment. He already ended that false identity and the tendency to go towards pleasure of addiction along with it as well. That pleasure of addiction that only destroys us. If we can't see the effects of the cross yet, it is because we don't believe in it 100% yet. Because you gotta believe good news in order to enjoy them. If we don't believe them, how can we be able to enjoy them? Thank you so much for listening to the episode. I would love to hear your opinion, your point of view on sin, what it represents to you, what this has helped you understand about sin, and what it has done to humanity. And if you've gone through some sort of redefinition of that word, just as it happened to me. God bless you and see you in the next episode.